My name is Stuart Bradley, and I've dedicated the last 20 years of my career to investigating missing persons, cases that conventional law enforcement has given up on. As a forensic genealogist specializing in cold cases, I've reunited families separated by decades, identified unknown victims through DNA analysis, and helped solve mysteries that seemed impossible to crack. But nothing in my extensive experience prepared me for what I discovered when I began researching the disappearance of Margaret Sullivan in March of this year. The case came to my attention through an unusual request from a retirement home in Portland, Maine. The administrator, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, contacted me about one of their residents who had simply vanished from her locked room overnight. No signs of forced entry, no indication of foul play, and certainly no logical explanation for how a 90-year-old woman with severe arthritis could have left the facility undetected. What made the case even more perplexing was that Margaret Sullivan had lived at Sunset Manor for over 15 years and had never shown any signs of confusion or dementia. But here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. According to the facility's records, Margaret Sullivan had an identical twin sister named Elizabeth, who had been living in the same retirement home for the exact same length of time. The sisters shared adjacent rooms, ate their meals together, and were rarely seen apart. They had arrived at Sunset Manor together in 2008, both widows with no living children or relatives. For 15 years, they had been inseparable companions in their twilight years, until the morning of March 15th, when the staff discovered that Margaret's room was empty, her bed unslept in, and her sister Elizabeth was sitting calmly in the common area, knitting as if nothing had happened. When questioned about Margaret's whereabouts, Elizabeth simply smiled and said her sister had gone home. But Margaret Sullivan had no other home. Sunset Manor had been her residence for over a decade. The police investigation yielded nothing. Security cameras showed no one entering or leaving Margaret's room during the night. The windows were locked from the inside and were too high and narrow for anyone to escape through, especially someone of Margaret's age and physical condition. It was as if she had simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only her personal belongings and a sister who seemed remarkably unconcerned about the disappearance. What caught my attention wasn't just the mysterious nature of the disappearance, but something Patricia Hendricks mentioned almost as an afterthought during our initial phone conversation. She had been going through the facility's old admission records to gather information for the police report when she noticed something odd about the Sullivan sisters' documentation. Their birth certificates listed their birth year as 1932, making them 91 years old at the time of Margaret's disappearance. But buried in their medical files was an older document, a yellowed piece of paper that appeared to be a church baptismal record, which listed their birth year as 1900. If the baptismal record was accurate, that would make the Sullivan twins 123 years old. Patricia had initially dismissed it as a clerical error, perhaps a typo or a document that had been misfiled. But something about the discrepancy nagged at her, especially given the strange circumstances surrounding Margaret's vanishing. Intrigued by this anomaly, I agreed to take on the case. My first step was to examine the documentation Patricia had mentioned. When I arrived at Sunset Manor, I immediately struck by the facility's atmosphere. Days later, I was a well-maintained, cheerful place with caring staff and comfortable accommodations. Nothing about it suggested the kind of environment where residents simply disappeared without explanation. Patricia met me in her office and spread out the Sullivan sisters' files on her desk. The birth certificates were standard modern documents, clearly issued within the last few decades as replacements for original certificates that had presumably been lost or damaged. But the baptismal record was something entirely different. The paper was fragile, yellowed with age, and bore the letterhead of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Boston. The document was dated September 1900 and recorded the baptism of twin girls, Margaret Rose and Elizabeth Clare, born to Patrick and Molly O'Brien on August 23, 1899. The handwriting was in the elegant script typical of that era, and the document bore an official church seal that appeared authentic. But what truly caught my attention was the condition of the document itself. While it was clearly old, it had been preserved with remarkable care. Most baptismal records from that period, if they survived at all, would be stored in church archives or family Bibles, yellowed and brittle from decades of handling and storage. This document, however, while aged, was in surprisingly good condition, as if it had been protected from the elements and carefully maintained over more than a century. I asked Patricia if I could speak with Elizabeth, hoping she might be able to shed some light on her sister's disappearance and the discrepancy in their ages. She led me through the facility's corridors to a sunny common room where several residents were engaged in various activities. Elizabeth Sullivan sat by a large window, her silver hair neatly arranged, working on an intricate piece of needlepoint. She looked up as we approached, and I was immediately struck by her appearance. Despite being listed as 91 years old on her official documents, Elizabeth possessed a vitality and alertness that seemed remarkable for someone of her supposed age. Her eyes were clear and bright, her hands steady as she worked the needle through the fabric, and her posture was remarkably straight for someone who should have been dealing with the typical physical challenges of advanced age. I introduced myself and explained that I was investigating her sister's disappearance. Elizabeth set down her needlework and regarded me with what I can only describe as an amused expression. When I asked about Margaret, she simply repeated what she had told the police and staff members. Her sister had gone home. When I pressed her about what she meant by home, since Sunset Manor had been their residence for 15 years, Elizabeth's response was enigmatic. She told me that some journeys take longer than others to complete, and that Margaret had simply finished hers first. She spoke with the kind of calm certainty that suggested she knew exactly what had happened to her sister, but she offered no concrete details about Margaret's whereabouts or how she had left the facility undetected. What struck me most about our conversation was Elizabeth's manner of speaking. While her vocabulary and grammar were consistent with someone of her generation, there were subtle linguistic quirks that suggested an even earlier era. She used phrases and expressions that were more typical of the early 20th century, and her accent carried traces of what sounded like an old Boston, Irish dialect that had largely disappeared by the 1950s. When I asked about their family history, Elizabeth became more forthcoming. She told me that she and Margaret had been orphaned as young children and had spent their early years in a Catholic orphanage in Boston. They had been inseparable from birth, she explained, and had faced every challenge in life together. She spoke of the orphanage with a mixture of fondness and sadness, describing the strict but caring nuns who had raised them and the other children who had become like family. According to Elizabeth, she and Margaret had left the orphanage when they turned 18 and had worked various jobs in Boston before eventually marrying and starting families of their own. Both had been widowed young, she said, and had reconnected in their later years after losing touch for several decades. They had decided to spend their remaining years together, which was how they had ended up at Sunset Manor. The story was plausible enough, but something about the way Elizabeth told it felt rehearsed, as if she had repeated these details many times before. There were gaps in the narrative that didn't quite make sense, and when I asked specific questions about dates or locations, her answers became vague and evasive. After my conversation with Elizabeth, I began conducting my own research into the Sullivan sisters' background. Using the information from both the birth certificates and the baptismal record, I started searching historical records, census data, and archived documents that might shed light on their true identities and ages. What I discovered over the next several weeks was both fascinating and deeply troubling. If the baptismal record was accurate, and the twins had indeed been born in 1899, then their life story was far more complex and mysterious than Elizabeth had suggested. The records I found painted a picture of two girls who had experienced tragedy and displacement from a very early age, but who had also demonstrated a remarkable ability to survive and adapt in ways that seemed almost impossible. The trail began with the 1900 census, which listed Patrick and Molly O'Brien as residents of a tenement building in Boston's South End. Patrick was recorded as a dock worker, Molly as a seamstress, and their infant twin daughters were listed as Margaret and Elizabeth O'Brien, born in August of the previous year. But by the 1910 census, there was no record of the O'Brien family at that address or anywhere else in Boston. What I did find was a record of 2 young girls, aged approximately 7, who had been admitted to the St. Catherine's Home for Children in September 1906. The admission records listed them only as Margaret and Elizabeth, with no surname given. The notes indicated that they had been found wandering the streets of Boston's North End, apparently abandoned and unable or unwilling to provide information about their families. The circumstances of their discovery were unusual enough to warrant a brief mention in the Boston Herald. The newspaper article, dated September 12, 1906, described how 2 identical twin girls had been found by a patrol officer in the early hours of the morning, sitting on the steps of St. Mary's Catholic Church. They were well dressed but appeared to be in a state of shock or confusion. Despite repeated questioning by police and social workers, the girls would only give their first names and remain silent about their family or how they had come to be alone on the church steps. What made the case even more mysterious was that no missing persons reports had been filed for children matching their description. No family members came forward to claim them, and despite extensive investigations, authorities were unable to determine their identities or locate any relatives. After several weeks in temporary care, the girls were transferred to St. Catherine's Home for Children, where they would remain for the next 11 years. The records from St. Catherine's painted a picture of 2 girls who were bright, well-behaved, and devoted to each other. Margaret was described as the more outgoing of the 2, quick to make friends with the other children and eager to please the nuns who ran the orphanage. Elizabeth was noted as being quieter and more reserved, but equally intelligent and capable. Both girls excelled in their studies and were considered model residents of the institution. But there were also notes in their files that suggested something unusual about the twins. Several of the nuns had commented on their mature demeanor and sophisticated vocabulary, which seemed advanced for their apparent age. There were also mentions of the girls displaying knowledge of events and customs that predated their supposed birth, though these observations were generally dismissed as the product of active imaginations or stories they might have heard from older residents. As I delved deeper into the historical records, I began to uncover evidence that challenged everything I thought I knew about Margaret and Elizabeth Sullivan. The more I learned about their past, the more questions arose about their true identities and the circumstances that had led to Margaret's mysterious disappearance over a century later. The story I was uncovering was far stranger than a simple missing persons case. It was a mystery that spanned more than 100 years and involved 2 women whose very existence seemed to defy the normal boundaries of human experience. And as I continued my investigation, I began to realize that Margaret's disappearance might not have been the end of their story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in a tale that had been unfolding for far longer than anyone could have imagined. What I discovered next would challenge everything I thought I understood about the passage of time and human mortality. The records from St. Catherine's Home revealed a pattern that seemed impossible, yet was documented with meticulous care by the nuns who had dedicated their lives to caring for orphan children. According to the detailed logs kept by Sister Mary Augustine, the head of the orphanage, Margaret and Elizabeth exhibited behaviors that consistently puzzled the staff. While other children their age struggled with basic arithmetic, the twins demonstrated an understanding of mathematics that seemed far beyond their years. They could perform complex calculations in their heads and showed an intuitive grasp of concepts that weren't typically taught until much later in a child's education. More troubling were the historical references they would casually make in conversation. Elizabeth, in particular, would sometimes speak about events from the 1880s and early 1890s with a familiarity that suggested personal experience rather than knowledge gained from books or stories. When questioned about these references, she would become evasive, claiming she had heard the stories from other children or had read about them in the orphanage library. Sister Mary Augustine had noted in her records that both girls seemed to possess an unusual understanding of death and loss that went beyond what might be expected from children who had experienced the trauma of abandonment. They would comfort younger children who were grieving the loss of parents with a wisdom and compassion that seemed to come from deep personal experience. Yet when asked about their own parents or family, they would claim to have no memories of life before arriving at the church steps. The medical records from their time at St. Catherine's revealed another perplexing detail. Dr. James Morrison, who served as the orphanage physician, had noted that both girls appeared to age more slowly than their peers. While other children showed the normal signs of growth and development, Margaret and Elizabeth seemed to remain remarkably unchanged year after year. Dr. Morrison had initially attributed this to malnutrition or some form of developmental delay, but as the years passed, he began to suspect something more unusual was occurring. In a letter to the Mother Superior dated 1914, Dr. Morrison expressed his concerns about the twins' apparent resistance to common childhood illnesses that regularly swept through the orphanage. While other children would fall victim to influenza, scarlet fever, or tuberculosis, Margaret and Elizabeth remained healthy and vigorous. When they did occasionally show symptoms of illness, they would recover with remarkable speed, often within hours rather than the days or weeks typically required. The doctor had requested permission to conduct more thorough medical examinations of the girls, but his letter indicated that they had become increasingly resistant to such scrutiny. They would comply with basic health checks, but would become agitated and uncooperative when he attempted more detailed assessments. Sister Mary Augustine had noted that the girls seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was becoming too curious about their unique characteristics. By 1917, when Margaret and Elizabeth would have been 18 according to their supposed birth year, the orphanage records showed they had reached the age limit for residency at St. Catherine's. The transition notes indicated that both girls had secured employment as seamstresses at a textile factory in Boston's garment district and had found lodging in a boarding house that catered to young working women. What happened next was where the historical trail became even more confusing. I found employment records that showed Margaret and Elizabeth O'Brien working at the Blackstone Mills from 1917 to 1923. But then their names appeared again in completely different records spanning the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, always together, always as twins, but sometimes with different surnames and occasionally different stated ages. In 1934, I found marriage records for a Margaret O'Brien who married a man named Thomas Sullivan in Boston. The bride's age was listed as 25, which would have made her birth year 1909. Not 1899 as the baptismal record indicated. Just 3 months later, Elizabeth O'Brien married Thomas Sullivan's brother, Patrick Sullivan, also listing her age as 25. But here's where the story becomes even stranger. I discovered death certificates for both Thomas and Patrick Sullivan, dated 1943 and 1945 respectively. Both men had died in their 40s from heart conditions, leaving their wives widowed at what should have been relatively young ages. Yet the women who identified themselves as Margaret and Elizabeth Sullivan continued to appear in various records throughout the following decades, seemingly unchanged by the passage of time. Employment records from the 1950s showed both women working as nurses' aides at Boston General Hospital. Their personnel files contained photographs that, when compared to earlier images from their orphanage days, showed faces that appeared virtually unchanged despite the passage of 40 years. The hospital administrator had noted in their files that both women possessed an unusual depth of medical knowledge and seemed particularly skilled at comforting patients who were near death. In 1963, I found records showing that Margaret and Elizabeth Sullivan had relocated to Portland, Maine, where they found employment at a local hospital. Once again, Their personnel files contained photographs that showed faces that seemed to have aged minimally since their previous positions. Colleagues described them as dedicated, compassionate workers who had an almost uncanny ability to sense when patients were in distress, even from across a busy ward. The pattern continued through the 1970s and 1980s, with the sisters periodically changing employers and sometimes relocating to different cities, but always remaining together and always maintaining their identities as twins born in the early 20th century. In each new position, they would present themselves as being in their 60s or 70s, though their appearance and vitality suggested women decades younger. What struck me as particularly significant was how they seemed to anticipate when their apparent lack of aging might draw unwanted attention. They would typically remain in one location for 10 to 15 years before quietly relocating, always with proper documentation and references that seemed to verify their stated ages and work histories. It was as if they had perfected a system of reinvention that allowed them to move through the decades without arousing suspicion. The final piece of this puzzle came when I examined their admission records to Sunset Manor in 2008. By this time, they were presenting themselves as women in their late 70s, recent widows who had decided to spend their remaining years in a comfortable retirement community. Their health evaluation showed them to be in remarkably good condition for their stated ages, with no significant medical issues beyond what might be expected from normal aging. But buried in their medical files was a note from Dr. Sarah Chun, the facility's staff physician, who had conducted their initial health assessments. Dr. Chun had noted that both women showed unusual cellular characteristics in their blood work, with cell regeneration rates that seemed more consistent with people decades younger than their stated ages. She had recommended follow-up testing, but her notes indicated that both Margaret and Elizabeth had declined additional medical examinations, claiming they preferred to avoid unnecessary medical interventions at their age. As the first pieced together this century-spanning timeline, I began to understand that Margaret's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a pattern that had been developing over more than 100 years. The Sullivan twins had somehow managed to exist at the margins of normal human experience, aging slowly if at all, and periodically reinventing themselves to avoid detection. But what was their true nature? Were they simply remarkably long-lived humans who had discovered some secret to extending their lifespans? Or was something more extraordinary at work, something that challenged our understanding of mortality itself? The evidence I had gathered suggested possibilities that I was reluctant to consider, theories that belonged more in the realm of folklore than forensic investigation. The answer, I suspected, lay not in the past but in the present, with Elizabeth Sullivan, who continued to sit calmly in Sunset Manor's common room, working on her needlepoint and waiting for someone to ask the right questions. She held the key to understanding not only what had happened to Margaret, but what these two remarkable women truly were, and why they had spent over a century moving through the world like shadows, visible but never quite real. My investigation had revealed a mystery far more complex than a simple missing persons case. I was dealing with two individuals whose very existence seemed to violate the natural order, and whose story was still being written after more than 120 years. The question now was whether I was brave enough to uncover the truth, and whether the world was ready to accept what that truth might reveal about the nature of life, death, and the space that exists between them. My next step was to arrange another meeting with Elizabeth, but this time I came prepared with specific questions and documentation that might prompt her to reveal more about her true history. I had photocopied several of the historical records I'd uncovered, including the original St. Catherine's Orphanage files and the various employment documents that tracked their movements across the decades. When I entered the common room at Sunset Manor, Elizabeth was in her usual spot by the window, but instead of needlepoint, she was reading a leather-bound book that looked considerably older than anything typically found in a retirement home library. As I approached, she looked up with what I now recognized as a knowing smile, as if she had been expecting my return. I sat down across from her and spread out copies of the documents on the small table between us. Her reaction was immediate and telling. Rather than surprise or confusion, her expression shifted to one of resigned acceptance, as if this moment had been inevitable. She closed her book carefully and folded her hands in her lap, studying me with those remarkably clear eyes. When I asked her directly about the discrepancies in the records, about the photographs that showed faces unchanged across decades, about the pattern of relocations and reinventions, Elizabeth remained silent for several long minutes. Finally, she spoke in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. She told me that some stories were too old and too strange for the modern world to accept. She said that she and Margaret had learned long ago that the truth about their nature would only bring unwanted attention and disbelief. People, she explained, preferred mysteries that could be solved with conventional explanations, not ones that challenged their understanding of what was possible. I pressed her for specifics, showing her the orphanage records that documented their unusual maturity and resistance to illness. Elizabeth examined the papers with the careful attention of someone seeing old family photographs, touching the edges of the documents as if they held memories she had tried to forget. Then she began to tell me a story that defied everything I thought I knew about human mortality and the passage of time. She spoke of being born in 1899, not to the O'Brien family as the baptismal record suggested, but to parents whose names had been lost to time and circumstance. She and Margaret, she said, had been different from other children even in infancy, developing more quickly mentally while their physical aging seemed to follow different rules. Their parents had died in a tenement fire when the twins were 6 years old, but not the kind of ordinary tragedy that claimed so many lives in Boston's overcrowded neighborhoods at the turn of the century. Elizabeth described a blaze that had consumed their building with supernatural intensity, leaving behind only ash and mystery. She and Margaret had survived not through luck or rescue, but through some innate resistance to the flames that had claimed everyone else in their family. The girls had wandered the streets for days after the fire, she explained, sustained by something other than food or water. They had been found on the church steps not because they had sought sanctuary, but because some instinct had drawn them there, as if they belonged in places where the boundary between the sacred and the ordinary was thinner. At St. Catherine's, Elizabeth continued, she and Margaret had learned to hide their true nature. They discovered that they could control their apparent rate of aging to some degree, slowing it when they needed to blend in with their peers, and allowing it to progress more normally when they needed to appear older. The nuns, she said, had suspected something unusual about them, but had attributed their peculiarities to the trauma of losing their parents. Elizabeth paused in her narrative, looking out the window at the autumn afternoon light filtering through the trees. When she resumed speaking, her voice carried a weight of sadness that seemed to encompass decades of loss and isolation. She told me that she and Margaret had discovered early in life that they were not entirely human, at least not in the conventional sense. They aged differently, healed from injuries with remarkable speed, and possessed an intuitive understanding of death and dying that went beyond normal human experience. Over the decades, they had learned to navigate the world by periodically reinventing themselves, always staying together, always protecting their secret. The marriages to the Sullivan brothers had been strategic, Elizabeth explained, a way to acquire new identities and social legitimacy during an era when unmarried women faced significant challenges. The brothers had been kind men who had never questioned their wives' unusual vitality or their tendency to look younger than their stated ages. When Thomas and Patrick had died, Margaret and Elizabeth had genuinely mourned them, but they had also recognized the opportunity to once again disappear and re-emerge with fresh identities. I asked Elizabeth what she and Margaret truly were, what condition or curse had granted them this extended existence. Her answer was both simple and deeply unsettling. She said they were what remained when death chose to be patient rather than immediate, when the natural order decided that some souls needed more time to complete their purpose in the world. According to Elizabeth, she and Margaret had been marked by their survival of that long-ago fire, changed in ways that made them something between the living and the dead. They existed in a liminal space, aging slowly, healing quickly, and carrying within them an awareness of mortality that allowed them to comfort others facing death. They had spent over a century serving as guides for those making the transition from life to whatever came after. But recently, Elizabeth continued, something had begun to change. Margaret had started experiencing what she called the calling, a pull toward something beyond the physical world that grew stronger with each passing year. She had begun to speak of being ready to complete the journey that had been interrupted by the fire so many years ago. The night Margaret disappeared, Elizabeth explained, her sister had simply chosen to answer that calling. She had not died in any conventional sense, but had allowed herself to transition to whatever existence awaited beings like them when their earthly purpose was fulfilled. The locked room, the lack of physical evidence, the apparent impossibility of her departure, all made sense when viewed through the lens of a transformation that transcended normal physical laws. Elizabeth told me that she had felt Margaret's departure like a severing of something essential within herself. For over a century, they had been two halves of a single existence, bound together by their shared nature and their mutual understanding of their role in the world. Now, for the first time in more than 120 years, Elizabeth was truly alone. I asked her why she was sharing this information with me, why she was finally willing to reveal the truth about her and Margaret's nature. Elizabeth smiled sadly and told me that she too was beginning to feel the calling, the gentle pull toward whatever realm Margaret had entered. She said she had perhaps months, maybe a year at most, before she would follow her sister's path. But she also said that their story deserved to be told, at least partially, so that someone would understand that not all mysteries had conventional solutions. She had chosen to trust me with this knowledge because my work involved reuniting families and solving cold cases, and in a way, she was preparing for the ultimate reunion with her twin sister. Elizabeth then asked me a question that caught me completely off guard. She wanted to know if I believed her story, if I could accept the possibility that some people existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience. Her eyes searched my face as if my answer would determine whether she continued her revelations or retreated back into the carefully constructed fiction she had maintained for decades. I found myself in the strange position of having to examine my own beliefs about the nature of reality. Everything I had discovered in my investigation supported Elizabeth's claims, no matter how impossible they seemed. The evidence pointed to two individuals who had somehow transcended normal human limitations, existing for over a century while maintaining their identities and their bond with each other. Looking into Elizabeth's ancient eyes, I realized that I did believe her. The alternative explanations, elaborate hoaxes involving forged documents and staged photographs spanning multiple decades, seemed far less plausible than the simple acceptance that some things in this world defied conventional understanding. When I told Elizabeth that I believed her story, something in her demeanor shifted. The careful guardedness that had characterized all our previous interactions melted away, replaced by a profound sense of relief. She had been carrying this secret for more than a century, and finally sharing it with someone who accepted its truth seemed to lift a burden she had grown accustomed to bearing alone. Elizabeth then made a request that would fundamentally change the direction of my investigation. She asked me to help her prepare for her own departure, not by preventing it or trying to convince her to remain, but by documenting her story and ensuring that when she chose to follow Margaret, someone would understand what had happened and why. She also revealed something that made my blood run cold. Margaret's disappearance had not been entirely voluntary. While Elizabeth had described it as answering a calling, she now admitted that something had been drawing her sister away, something that had grown stronger and more insistent over the past several years. Margaret had fought against it for as long as she could, but in the end, she had been unable to resist whatever force was pulling her toward her final transformation. Elizabeth feared that the same force was now turning its attention to her, and she was uncertain whether she possessed the strength that Margaret had shown in resisting it for so long. She spoke of dreams where Margaret appeared to her, not as the elderly woman she had been at Sunset Manor, but as the young girl she had been at St. Catherine's Orphanage, beckoning Elizabeth to join her in whatever realm she now inhabited. The implications of Elizabeth's revelations were staggering. If her account was accurate, then Margaret had not simply vanished but had been claimed by some supernatural force that collected beings like the Sullivan twins when their earthly existence reached its predetermined end. And that same force was now pursuing Elizabeth, drawing her toward a reunion with her sister that would mark the end of their extraordinary journey through more than a century of human history. As our conversation concluded, Elizabeth made one final confession that would haunt me for weeks to come. She told me that she and Margaret were not unique, that throughout their long lives, they had occasionally encountered others like themselves, individuals who existed in that space between life and death, aging slowly and serving as guides for those facing mortality. Some of these others, Elizabeth said, had simply vanished one day, called away to whatever existence awaited them. Others had chosen to remain hidden, living solitary lives and avoiding the connections that might expose their true nature. But all of them, she believed, would eventually face the same choice that Margaret had confronted: to answer the calling and complete their transition, or to resist and risk something far worse than natural death. Elizabeth's story had transformed my investigation from a missing persons case into something far more profound and disturbing. I was no longer simply trying to locate a disappeared elderly woman, but attempting to understand the nature of beings who challenged everything we thought we knew about human existence. And I was racing against time to document their story before Elizabeth, too, answered the call that had claimed her sister. The question that now consumed me was not where Margaret had gone, but whether Elizabeth could be protected from the force that was drawing her toward the same fate. And if not, whether I would be witness to another impossible disappearance that would leave behind only questions and the fading memory of two remarkable women who had touched countless lives across more than a century of hidden existence. As I left Sunset Manor that evening, my mind reeled from Elizabeth's revelations. The weight of her story pressed down on me like a physical burden, and I found myself questioning everything I thought I understood about the world. But my training as a forensic genealogist had taught me to follow evidence wherever it led, no matter how uncomfortable the destination. Over the next few days, I threw myself into researching the phenomenon Elizabeth had described. If she and Margaret were not unique, if there were others like them moving through the world, then surely there would be traces, patterns that could be identified and documented. I began searching historical records for unexplained disappearances, people who had lived unusually long lives, individuals who seemed to age differently than their contemporaries. What I discovered was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Scattered throughout American history were accounts of people who defied normal aging patterns, who possessed unusual healing abilities, who seemed to understand death in ways that went beyond ordinary human experience. Most of these accounts had been dismissed as folklore, exaggeration, or simple record-keeping errors. But when examined collectively, they formed a pattern that supported Elizabeth's claims about the existence of others like herself and Margaret. In the archives of the Chicago Historical Society, I found records of a woman named Catherine Murphy who had worked as a midwife in the city's Irish neighborhoods from the 1890s through the 1940s. Newspaper accounts described her as possessing an almost supernatural ability to save mothers and babies during difficult births, and colleagues noted that she seemed to remain remarkably youthful despite decades of demanding work. Catherine had disappeared in 1951, leaving behind only a note saying she had been called home to family. Similar stories emerged from archives across the country. A schoolteacher in Kansas who had educated 3 generations of children while appearing to age only slightly herself. A nurse in San Francisco who had worked through both world wars and the influenza pandemic of 1918, never falling ill despite constant exposure to disease. a minister in Georgia who had comforted the dying for over 60 years, always knowing exactly what words would bring peace to those facing their final moments. In each case, the individual had eventually vanished without explanation, leaving behind only stories of their unusual abilities and their apparent resistance to normal aging. The disappearances typically occurred when the person would have been well over 100 years old, though they often appeared decades younger than their documented age. But perhaps most disturbing were the accounts I found of what happened to some of these individuals when they tried to resist whatever force eventually claimed them. In a private journal donated to the Louisiana State Archives, I discovered the writings of Dr. Henry Boudreau, a physician who had practiced in New Orleans. From the 1880s through the 1930s, Dr. Boudreau had encountered several patients over the years who exhibited the same characteristics Elizabeth had described, and he had documented their eventual fates with scientific precision. According to Dr. Boudreau's observations, those who attempted to resist the calling faced increasingly intense supernatural pressure. They would experience vivid dreams of deceased loved ones, beckoning them to join them. Objects in their homes would move without explanation. They would hear voices calling their names in empty rooms. The pressure would build steadily until they either succumbed willingly or were forcibly taken. Dr. Boudreau had witnessed one such forced taking in 1923. A woman named Marie Thibodeau, who had served as a folk healer in the Bayou country for over 70 years, had refused to answer what she described as the call of her ancestors. On the night of her disappearance, Dr. Boudreau had been summoned to her cabin by neighbors who reported strange lights and sounds coming from her property. He arrived to find Marie's home filled with an unnatural mist that seemed to move with purposeful intelligence. Marie herself stood in the center of her main room, surrounded by shadowy figures that appeared to be reaching for her. She looked directly at Dr. Boudreau and spoke words that he recorded verbatim in his journal. "Tell them that some debts cannot be avoided forever. The fire that spared us demands its due." Then Marie and the shadowy figures vanished, leaving behind only the scent of smoke and a circle of ash on the cabin floor. Dr. Boudreau had searched for rational explanations for what he had witnessed, but eventually concluded that he had observed something beyond the scope of conventional science. The reference to fire in Marie's final words struck me as particularly significant, given Elizabeth's account of the tenement blaze that had changed her and Margaret's fundamental nature. It suggested that the calling was connected to whatever force had originally marked these individuals as different, a cosmic debt that eventually came due no matter how long it was deferred. Armed with this new understanding, I returned to Sunset Manor to share my findings with Elizabeth. I found her in her room this time, sitting by the window and staring out at the gardens with an expression of profound melancholy. When I entered, she turned to me with eyes that seemed even more ancient than before, as if the weight of centuries had suddenly become unbearable. I told her about the historical accounts I had discovered, the pattern of individuals like herself and Margaret, who had lived extended lives before eventually answering a supernatural calling. Elizabeth listened without surprise, nodding occasionally as if I were simply confirming things she had always known but never spoken aloud. When I finished my account, Elizabeth was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She told me that she had been dreaming of Margaret every night since our last conversation. In these dreams, her sister appeared as she had been in their youth, standing in a place that looked like the orphanage but bathed in golden light. Margaret would reach out her hand and speak words that Elizabeth could never quite remember upon waking, but which left her with an overwhelming sense of longing. Elizabeth also confessed that the supernatural pressure Dr. Boudreau had documented was beginning to affect her as well. Objects in her room had started moving on their own, and she frequently heard voices calling her name when she was alone. The staff at Sunset Manor had begun to notice her increasing agitation, though they attributed it to grief over Margaret's disappearance. Most troubling of all, Elizabeth had begun to see shadowy figures in her peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when she turned to look directly at them. but which seemed to be growing more solid and persistent with each passing day. She recognized them as harbingers of the same force that had eventually claimed Margaret, and she knew that her time was running short. I asked Elizabeth if there was anything that could be done to protect her from this supernatural pressure, any way to resist or delay the calling that seemed to be drawing her toward the same fate as her sister. Her answer was both heartbreaking and terrifying. She told me that resistance was possible but came at a terrible cost. Those who fought against the calling too long risked losing their essential humanity, becoming something trapped between worlds, neither fully alive nor properly dead. Elizabeth had seen this happen to one other individual like herself, a man they had encountered in Chicago during the 1920s. He had refused to answer the calling for decades beyond his natural time, and the prolonged resistance had twisted him into something monstrous. He existed in a state of constant torment, neither able to live normally nor to die peacefully, haunting the margins of human society and bringing misfortune to anyone who came too close to him. The memory of this tortured soul had convinced Elizabeth that when her time came, she would not resist as he had done. She would follow Margaret willingly, trusting that whatever existence awaited them beyond the physical world was preferable to the alternative of becoming a lost spirit trapped between realms. But Elizabeth also revealed something that gave me hope for preserving at least part of their story. Before Margaret's departure, the sisters had worked together to create a detailed record of their century-long existence. Hidden in Elizabeth's room was a collection of documents, photographs, and personal accounts that chronicled their extraordinary journey through American history. Elizabeth had been waiting for someone trustworthy to entrust with these materials, someone who would understand their significance and ensure that their story was preserved even after both sisters had answered the calling. She believed that I was that person, and she was prepared to turn over their hidden archive to my care. The archive, Elizabeth explained, contained not only their personal history, but also information about others like them whom they had encountered over the decades. There were names, locations, and detailed accounts of individuals who possessed the same unusual characteristics that had defined the Sullivan twins' existence. Some of these people might still be alive, moving through the world as Margaret and Elizabeth had done, hiding their true nature while serving as guides for those facing mortality. Elizabeth hoped that by documenting these stories and preserving this knowledge, future researchers might be able to understand and perhaps help others like herself and Margaret. She wanted their century-long existence to serve some greater purpose, to contribute to human knowledge, even if that knowledge challenged conventional understanding of life and death. As Elizabeth spoke about the hidden archive, I could see the physical toll that maintaining her resistance to the calling was taking on her. Her hands shook slightly as she gestured, and her voice carried a tremor of exhaustion that suggested someone fighting a battle on multiple fronts. The supernatural forces drawing her toward her final transformation were clearly growing stronger, and I realized that our time to preserve her story was rapidly running out. I agreed to accept custody of the archive and promised Elizabeth that I would do everything in my power to ensure that her and Margaret's story was properly documented and understood. The relief in her eyes when I made this commitment was profound, as if she had finally found someone willing to carry a burden that had grown too heavy for her to bear alone. Elizabeth then made arrangements for me to retrieve the hidden materials the following day. She would need time to gather everything and to prepare what she called her final testimony, a detailed account of her experiences with the calling and her observations about the supernatural forces that governed the existence of beings like herself and Margaret. As I prepared to leave that evening, Elizabeth caught my hand and held it with surprising strength. She looked directly into my eyes and spoke words that would echo in my mind for days to come. She told me that by accepting their story and agreeing to preserve their legacy, I had become part of something larger than a simple historical record. I had become a guardian of knowledge that bridged the gap between the known and unknown, between the world of ordinary human experience and the realm of supernatural possibility. Elizabeth warned me that this knowledge would change me, that understanding the true nature of her and Margaret's existence would alter my perception of reality in ways I might not anticipate. She said that once I fully grasped what they had been and what they had experienced, I would never again be able to view the world through purely rational eyes. But she also told me that this transformation was necessary, that there were others like herself and Margaret still moving through the world, and that someone with the skills and resources to investigate their stories needed to be prepared to recognize them when they appeared. She believed that I had been chosen for this role, not by chance but by the same mysterious forces that had guided her and Margaret's extended existence. As I drove home that night, I found myself looking at the world differently already. Every elderly person I passed on the street became a potential mystery. Every unexplained disappearance I had investigated in my career took on new significance. The comfortable boundaries between the possible and impossible had begun to blur, and I realized that Elizabeth had been right about the transformative power of this knowledge. The next morning, I returned to Sunset Manor to collect the archive Elizabeth had promised me. But when I arrived, I found the facility in a state of controlled chaos. Ambulances were parked outside, and staff members were moving with the urgent efficiency that indicated a medical emergency. Patricia Hendricks met me at the entrance, her face pale with shock and confusion. She told me that Elizabeth had been found in her room that morning, sitting peacefully in her chair by the window. She appeared to be sleeping, but when the staff tried to wake her for breakfast, they discovered that she was unresponsive. The paramedics had pronounced her dead at the scene, though they could find no obvious cause of death. But what had truly shaken the staff was what they had discovered in Elizabeth's room. Every piece of furniture had been moved to form a perfect circle around her chair, though no one could explain how an elderly woman with arthritis could have accomplished such a feat. The room was filled with the scent of smoke, despite the absence of any fire or burned material. And on the table beside her chair was a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be the archive she had promised me. 3 weeks have passed since Elizabeth's peaceful departure, and I've spent countless hours studying the remarkable archive she left behind. The documents paint a picture of two extraordinary souls who spent over a century guiding others through life's most difficult transitions, never seeking recognition or reward for their service. Their story challenges everything we think we know about mortality, aging, and the boundaries between life and death. But perhaps that's exactly what the world needs right now, a reminder that some mysteries can't be solved with conventional explanations, and that the most profound truths often exist in the spaces between what we can prove and what we can feel. Elizabeth and Margaret Sullivan may have answered their final calling, but their legacy lives on in every person they comforted, every soul they helped transition from this world to whatever lies beyond. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply being present when someone needs us most. And these remarkable twins did exactly that for more than 120 years.